All right, welcome to the fifth session of this workshop where we're going to be covering the proposal formats and requirements. So what format and what specific requirements the proposer's bids need to be in. So during this session, we're going to cover the following sessions. So the first, we're going to have a presentation helping you learn about key RFP proposal requirements. So about 10 or 15 minutes about that. We're going to dive into Henrico County's price proposal bid sheet and discuss how that's one aspect of the proposal requirements. Have some dedicated time for each city and county to work on the that should be proposal requirements section in the RFP template, and then have that last panel with the industry experts asking about the proposal requirements, do's and don'ts. So we can go ahead and dive into the presentation right now. So typically the proposal requirements section includes a couple key components, and these are the format and the content that you're requiring the developers to include in their proposal. So that would be something like including the cover letter, executive summary, and then the price proposal upfront, potentially utilizing that price proposal Excel sheet that we'll discuss later. And then specifications around their equipment, production guarantee, design plans for their system that they're proposing. An optional section on community co-benefits, if that's something that your city or county is requesting the developer to include. The experience of both the company overall and also the project team working on your proposal. Any financing plan that the developer is going to have to finance the project and how they're going to secure the necessary financing, safety plan, and finally the bidder's proposed schedule. So hopefully that aligns with the schedule that you outlined, but requesting that the proposer include their schedule as well. So there's a lot in this section in that RFP template that we've provided for you. In the next 10 or so minutes, I'm going to just focus on 3 of these because they're the ones that are more project specific. The other ones are a little more boilerplate that you can include that are typical in most templates. So first, starting with the developer and team experience, understanding each proposer's experience helps you evaluate which are the most qualified to deliver. So knowing a couple things about that. So having the proposer specify the following. First, just the minimum number of projects they've completed in a specified number of previous years that are similar both in the scope and complexity of the projects that you're bidding on. The number of projects they've completed in or around the city or county. So an understanding of how many projects they've done locally, either in your state or maybe perhaps actually in your city or county as well, to get a sense of if they have worked in your city, know the appropriate regulations in your state and things like that. The years the company's been in business, if they had any experience working with local governments and specific references that you can refer to, and then any litigation as well. There's other things you can include in this section, but these are some of the core parts to make sure you include in the developer and team experience section, which we'll be having you specify the details here during the city work time. Moving on to the co-benefits, this is allowing the developer to include a section dedicated to community co-benefits so that it allows them the opportunity to describe how they can meet your needs. So we've said this before in the RFP purpose, in the project overview section, in the proposal evaluation, what is the purpose of this RFP? What are your main motivations and goals? This section allows the developer to speak directly to that on how they can meet some of those community co-benefits. So this is an example from the city of Charlotte's recent RFP. This is actually an offsite project, but it's an example that could be used in on-site as well, where they include a section for the developer to describe local economic or community benefits resulting from project implementation, including employment, education, availability of data, environmental considerations, other things like that. So really giving the developer the opportunity to describe that in this section. So those are two. The third that I wanted to speak to and give the most amount of time on, because we've had a lot of questions around this, or at least energy around this topic, is the price proposal section. So one thing that I thought it would be helpful to note is that it is important to state the financial parameter assumptions for three things: discount rate, the city or county's discount rate, and then the utility or retail electricity escalation rate assumption for future years, and then the financial analysis length. All three of those have a very large impact on the net present value or the overall financial proposal that you'll get. So ensuring that all the developers are using the same assumptions helps to have bids that you can compare apples to apples. So I have a quick example that will be a refresher for some of you that were in the on-site solar cohort webinar back in February, but for some of you, this might be new. So this is one example where if you don't state the financial parameters, the developer might make the project look really good. So let's say that the base analysis has three main assumptions. So 4% discount rate, 2.3% utility price escalation rate in the future, and doing an analysis over 25 years. That should come out to, in this example, for a 100 kilowatt system, just a kind of a random example here, that would yield a net present value of a little over $22,000. But if you allowed the developers to kind of use whichever assumptions they wanted to use, such as a lower discount rate, that would increase the project net present value to over $40,000, a higher utility escalation rate, now you're up to over $70,000. And then if you do the analysis over 30 years, now you're up to the project looking like the net present value might be $97,000. So the takeaway here is, if you leave it up to the developer to provide their own assumptions, the proposals might not be apples to apples because the assumptions would be different. And the second example is just the opposite. So same base example, but in the opposite direction. If they're using a higher discount rate, lower utility escalation rate, and a lower analysis period, all of a sudden it looks like your project's not going to make money over the long term. So this is, again, just an example to illustrate how important it is to state these assumptions around financial parameters. And that leads into this final slide that I was going to present on the Excel-based RFP bid sheet. The advantage here is that it's providing a standard template for the proposals and allows the buyer, so the city or county in this instance, to make an apples to apples comparison. So typically there's three main required inputs that you would require the proposer or the bidder to include. So obviously the PPA price or the solar lease price, or if you're doing an upfront purchase, what the upfront cost of the system would be. So obviously the main financial parameter there. You could consider requiring in this section separate pricing around the actual system, as well as the interconnection and permitting costs, just to see if there's a different assumption regarding some of the costs that aren't as, that should be standardized across projects for interconnection and permitting, just to make sure that the developer and proposer here are using an accurate way to estimate that. So that's one potential consideration. The other required inputs would be the size of the solar PV systems and their associated generation. So either on an annual basis, so stating what the kilowatt hour per year would be for each of those sites, or in some instances, you would need the developer to include the estimated hourly solar PV generation. In instances where you might be operating, your electric rate might be a time of use rate, so it matters when the solar PV system is generating how much value it has, or perhaps the solar PV system size is large enough that a lot of time through the year it's generating more than the site load. So there could be some nuances around net metering credits and how that works. So depending on how complex the analysis is going to be, depends on on whether you'd require annual or hourly data. And then the other part is what I just mentioned on the previous slide, is that in this Excel-based RFP bid sheet, it should integrate the city or county assumptions. So it should already have stated what the discount rate is, what the electricity price escalation rate is, and how long you'd like the analysis period to be, so that that's standard across the proposals. So fortunately, Carrie in Henrico County was nice enough to include her example Excel RFP bid sheet. So I was going to actually exit out of our presentation here to give you an example of what that might look like. And then if we have a little bit of time, maybe we can have some Q&A on this actual bid sheet. So as I was saying, in yellow would be those specifications that the developer would include, or the proposer. So the PPA rate and the associated escalation rate. And then any type of escalation rate after the purchase as well. And then the system size and kilowatts here, as well as the annual production and a degradation rate input as well. So in yellow is what the developer would include. And then these are some of those county assumptions that are included here. So the cost of the grid electricity, and then the grid electricity escalation rate there, assumption listed. It doesn't look like the discount rate was integrated into this. I think it was more of a simplified cash flow. But what this does is then, given all of those inputs, it would calculate the cumulative cash flow for this site over the specified 25-year term. And then it looks like there was an option to maybe extend that out as well. So that's one example of what this bid sheet could look like. So I wanted to quickly flag that's an example of what you might see. So the last 25 or so minutes, we can go over a little bit depending on the time that Sol Systems and Black Bear have for us, but about 25 minutes now for a panel similar to yesterday, just asking about the kind of do's and don'ts around requirements in the proposal requirements section of the RFP. Also, any questions you have from earlier this morning around project timeline, site visits, coronavirus impacts on timeline, things like that, can also feel free to ask. Just a reminder, I think everyone that's on this call today was also here yesterday, so we won't do full introductions, but just a reminder that we have Jill, Mark, and Victoria here from Sol Systems and Black Bear Energy. So yeah, they're here to try to answer all of the questions that you have. We're going to do a similar exercise to what we did yesterday, where we're going to have people use the annotation feature to type questions that they have onto this screen, and then I'll group them, and then we'll vote on which questions to start with. So if you go to the top of your screen, hit view options and annotate, and then hit the text option, you can type your questions onto the screen. All right, so I will try to see. It looks like the most hearts or stars were maybe around the top left question on, is it necessary to include the site or roof plans with the solar areas actually identified? But there's also some interest in specific sizes that developers are interested in, and then COVID-19 related impacts, and then some specifications around site visits. So let's maybe start with those 4 topics, and then we'll open it up for any other Q&A as we go. All right, so then we'll start with the question on, is it necessary for the city or county to, in the RFP attachments, include which areas of the roof they want the developer to utilize, or is that something that the developer is going to do? So really just specifying the address is all that's necessary. Either, yeah, Black Bear or Sol Systems, does that
I can jump in. When we put together our RFP, we always put together a property site deck. So it's just a PowerPoint deck, and we'll go on Google Earth and take an image of the area. It is important for a couple of reasons. You know, in some cases, it might not be very straightforward what the address is and what the rooftop is. And so just verifying, like, the site that comes up on Google Earth is yours. There are cases when, you know, the wrong site comes up, or there's multi building complex.
Mhm.
So I'd say that's the first reason why. The second reason is there are times when it's obvious that you can use the entire roof, or that there's some areas that are not usable, but certainly identifying, if there's some areas where you guys have future plans, that you plan to do something with the roof, or for whatever reason, that part of the roof is just not viable for solar, marking that off and identifying it. The other thing we like to put in our property site decks is where an estimate of where the meter location is. So where specifically they should be interconnecting. So the meters with the significant amount of load that you're providing in the RFP, that would also be an important piece to put in that deck. But then, yeah, I mean, they'll then pull it up on their own system. Some of them have ability to basically zoom in on roofs and get really accurate assessments of the rooftop equipment, and actually figuring out how much solar they can put there.
Thanks, Victoria. Anything to add, Jill or Mark?
Anything to add,
The
Mark?
exact same points. Yeah, Victoria's spot on.
Great.
And then it's obviously even more important for a ground-mounted carport array, because then it's much less clear if you give someone an address exactly what part of the land one is best used.
Thanks. And then, the second question was around how large do projects have to be to get your company engaged in doing a bid? So maybe I'll stick with Sol Systems for this one. Do you guys have like a minimum project size that you typically bid on?
I think that maybe we have a minimum, maybe like 1 megawatt in terms of a single project or portfolio might be the minimum size that we're interested in, but that doesn't mean that there's not other developers that are much more interested in smaller projects, so that shouldn't deter you from including those smaller projects.
Great. Yeah, I think we have a good spectrum of project sizes in our cohort, ranging from like just 100 kilowatt system to 10 or 15 megawatts across 30 sites. So a lot of differences in the project size we're looking at. But yeah, I think like you mentioned, certain developers might have minimum sizes, but I think there's always a developer out there that's probably interested regardless of the size. And
the other point I would say is, if we have a client that really wants to do something on 1 or 2 sites that's really small, we'll ask around with the developer community, but in a lot of those cases, that's when we point towards them owning the system. Just because in a lot of cases, the transaction cost to finance those projects wouldn't make it of an interest to any developers. So that's where it may make more sense to consider owning a project.
Thanks, Victoria. And there was a question on coronavirus related impacts, and how, maybe two-part, how it's been impacting you all this far, if it's been delaying projects and just the impacts that you've had. And then secondly, is it worth the city or county stating in the RFP bid, requesting how the developer's timeline might be impacted by COVID-19? Feel free to jump in, Jill.
Yeah, I'll jump in for a minute. Looking at sort of 3 phases of a project, one being the early phase, origination phase prior to award. That's been somewhat hard for us because a lot of the sales process happens face-to-face, and it's hard to get people, especially when they have new and difficult situations on their hand, to pay attention to solar. Not that we aren't continuing conversations with some new contacts and some old ones, but that's been tough. My groups work really in the middle of the project cycle on development and engineering. That's been proceeding pretty normally. A lot of that work can get done by people at home. Permitting offices are kind of hit and miss. Some of them are operating pretty well remotely, and some of them are shut down. And then the last end is construction. Again, kind of depending on what state you're in, you're seeing different effects right now. Again, that's very much temporary and probably won't affect a project being, just going into RFP stage right now. But in a couple states, construction sites are completely shut down. Other ones, they're operating relatively normally. And supply chain, surprisingly, has been operating relatively normally.
Thanks, Mark, for speaking to the impacts you've seen at Soul Systems. Jill or Victoria, do you have anything to add on that, or if it's worth the city or county requesting the developer to include how COVID-19 might impact their timeline?
One other aspect, it might be more important now than ever for if you are looking for third-party financing to get some clarity on what the developer's financing plan is, just because there's more uncertainty now, and a lot of times developers will bid in without necessarily a long-term owner selected. Next year, there's probably going to be a lower tax appetite, so the tax equity market will be shifting. So that's maybe not the biggest concern, because it can all get figured out, but maybe something to request a little more detail on in the financing section.
Yeah, that is a great point Jill made. We, have found that most of the channel partners we're working with that have, a great capital and a institutional investor that they partner with, which, I know Soul Systems does, that they still have great access to capital at some of the smaller players that might be struggling from a capital perspective. So I think that is a really great point. And I think it we always put in kind of notes and confirmations boxes. So I think, asking the question specific to this, county that we're building in, what do you anticipate the timeline impacts being is a great question to ask, as every county has been operating pretty differently. From our perspective, we've had clients ask, like, are developers still responding to RFPs, and like, should we be putting a pause on putting our projects out? And we say they absolutely are. They might need a bit more time, just because they're dealing with putting out fires and, figuring out all their projects that are further down the line are probably a bit more priority right now. So just giving them a bit more time, but I do think it absolutely makes sense to not put a pause on putting a project out to RFP at this point.
Thanks. So now the last question before opening it up to the broader group was around site visits. So a couple of questions here. Maybe I'll just ask all three and let Mark, Jill, or Victoria dive in for any of them. So the questions are, one, just when are site visits necessary? How many people do you send to a walkthrough? So probably both on the city county side, also on the developer side. And then lastly, there's this question on, for larger projects, let's say you have 30 or 40 sites, how do you pick the sites to do a site visit at? Do you only do a few, or do you do all of them over a couple days? So I'll open that up to Victoria, Jill, or Mark, if any of those questions speak to you.
Yeah, sure. I'll let Soul Systems, I mean, I'm sure they have a different opinion of when they prefer to do a site visit in a non-COVID environment. We normally recommend, pushing to get site visits after we've awarded a project to a specific developer. So all those awards are non-binding, but at that point, the development is spending due diligence dollars, and we want to get them out there, figuring out if the project is real. And in the tandem, we're also negotiating any of the contracts. So we have both those due diligence and contracts happening in tandem. I'd say the exception is if there's a project where we know there's going to be specific issues or concerns that could lead to, a site visit coming up with a very different proposal than a pre-bid site visit. And in that case, we'd probably recommend doing it like a short list. So invite 2 to 3 of the shortlisted parties to come do a site visit and then provide a best and final. I do think there are tons of ways to get around site visits in the RFP process. Really important things, like I mentioned, kind of in that property site deck, identifying an interconnection point. So they know, does there need to be a long conduit run from where the solar would be to where we would interconnect to a meter. I'd ask Soul Systems to elaborate on this one, but I know we often get, like questions about what is the voltage at the site, or getting pictures of the existing electrical equipment to get a sense of what upgrades would be needed. So certainly if you could get someone on site to take some of those pictures, and maybe Soul Systems could give some more advice about what types of pictures they'd need and would be most helpful. And And then, I'd be curious, I know a lot of our clients do drone visits, which, you don't need to have someone actually on site. I know like one of the engineering partners a lot of our developers work with, Pure Power, is not working at the moment. So I don't know if drone visits would need to be put on hold as well. But there's definitely a bunch of solutions to kind of delay the site visits and get some of the initial details further up. The other thing that we do where we know there's going to be some kind of difficult sites, we've got a client that has RV resorts like in California that are spread out over big areas, and in that we just requested that developers included like a very large buffer for long conduit runs and any utility upgrades. I think we said they should include like 20 cents a watt as a buffer, and the goal was once they'd get on site they'd value engineer. But if you have everyone building in that higher cost, theoretically it should be apples to apples. So those are just kind of some solutions to avoiding site visits in the current environment.
Thanks, that was really helpful. Jill or Mark, do you want to jump in with anything else?
Yeah, I'll say from an engineering point of view, we really like to see the site. It allows us to do a preliminary design, a preliminary cost estimate, scheduling a lot more accurately. So that the bid you're getting is going to be closer to a binding bid, and that's what we want to give you, just to set expectations at the right point as early as we can. Victoria made some great points. If you can send a batch of pictures of the point of the utility meter, the facility, electrical gear, as she noted, again, the surface where the array is going to go, whether that's a parking lot or a rooftop or an open piece of land, that can go a long way at the early stage, especially if it's difficult to arrange a site visit. If there's a large number of sites, like you're saying, I think that doing 5 to 10 sites out of a much bigger group can again be very useful. Attempt to pick the most representative or a range of the sizes and types available. And then as far as how many people we would send to a site visit, usually one. If it's very close to one of our offices or a very large opportunity, maybe we'll send 2, but we're not sending a crew of 5 or 10 people out to look at the sites.
Yeah, and just following up on that, the other documents that if a client has, we always like to include in an RFP or any ALTA surveys that show the area as well as setbacks and any easements, structural as-built, electrical one-line diagrams. So the more the merrier in terms of any information that can be provided. And then I would agree with Mark on like the 30 to 50 sites. One of our first clients was like, let's just see if we can do solar at everything. And I think we released an RFP for an absurd amount of sites and we got no bids. So if someone sees that, they're just going to be like, the client hasn't put in enough time to figure out which are going to be the best sites. So I'd recommend certainly, like, even if we have a long list, we'll pare it down to, I think, 10 sites. And that sounds like a good number of the ones that have the best host site, the most amount of load. And then once a developer has already signed a contract with you guys, built projects, from their perspective, they're absolutely willing to look at like the lower tail from a perspective of like a less attractive site, because their transaction costs, they've already, you've proven you're a client that would transact and they've got the existing contracts in place. So that's kind of how I would look at a greater opportunity. And you can always let them know we have other sites we want to look at with you guys, so we're a potentially larger client than just this first group. But I think paring it down to something that's been reviewed makes a lot of sense.
I was just going to say, anecdotally, we were working on a project actually for a municipality this past year, and the RFP consultant asked for everyone to assume sort of like best case scenario for a ground mount. And then, unfortunately, once the sites were further diligenced and the topography maps were created, there was such high civil costs and like so many site constraints that our proposed PPA price was actually no longer even offering them savings in the first year. So that's obviously like a really worst case scenario, but like Mark mentioned about setting expectations, probably is good to at least have some of that early diligence done so that you know that it's worth the time to even propose the PPA reviewer.
And the follow-up question I was going to ask was in the chat. Does the nature or need of site visits change based on whether it's a rooftop, ground mount, or canopy system?
Yeah, I'd say that it really depends on the site. Sometimes a rooftop with a clean roof and in an area with great satellite imagery, site visit is not important. Again, it kind of goes same for ground mounts. If it's a cornfield and the images are great and you can see the street view image of the distribution line right along the street, you might not need to go there. But in both cases, it could be the opposite. You have trees blocking some part of the view, or the images are very fuzzy, or it's very hard to tell where the interconnection might be, or if there's a stream going through the woods. So it really depends on the site.
Thanks. And I know we're running just a couple minutes over, so I'll, depending on if Mark, Jill, and Victoria can stay for a few minutes, people can stay and eat into their break that we have starting right now. But if people do want to stay, and if Soul Systems and Black Bear can stay for a few minutes to answer questions, that'd be great. I think the question in the chat on if developers prefer that governments create a short list of vendors would seem to be answered, that you all do prefer shortlisting vendors. Is that confirmed?
Yeah, but is that a different question? That's like before they've even provided. When I say shortlist, it's like after you've received all the proposals.
I think, yeah, so if you want to clarify that.
Yeah, it was a question or something that was raised prior to this little session. I guess some governments have a procurement process that allows them to, I guess, do a preliminary assessment of their proposers, and then they let people know who they're interested in getting a more full proposal from.
Yeah,
Is
that
it different?
definitely resonates with how we kind of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, because I don't know if other communities do something different, but so I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, and I would say in terms of, I mean, we've got our huge list of channel partners, and all of them we request that they provide a channel partner qualification form, which has, just background on their company where they've done projects. So a combination of that and, just actual qualitative phone calls with the main point of contact at the developers to determine if it's a project that they're going to be interested in. That's what helps us define. We do our RFPs are now invite only, so we will invite max 10 developers to review the RFP, and by letting them know, like, here's the list of 10 people that we're talking to, they can certainly know that it's worth their time to spend responding to the RFP. You can ask Jill. I mean, I think her job is mostly responding to RFPs. We have a lot of developers that hate RFPs and they don't do business that way. So just because it can be a time suck. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
We've there's a couple of states that have their Office of General Services might run an RFQ to have people bid in to be qualified solar developers, and that creates the invite-only list of developers that are allowed to receive the proposals, but they typically update the list every year or two or a couple of years. So I think either way is okay, and I do think that leaving it open to all developers isn't the worst thing in case there's newer developers with super relevant experience. But
yeah, I agree. I'd have kind of some method for if you think you'd be a great fit for the project to be able to reach out to you and get put onto that list.
Okay, thank you guys.
Great. So now I'll just open it up to anyone else. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. But I did want to make a quick check for Mark, Jill, and Victoria. I think I initially had reserved time up until a minute ago for you all. So just wanted to check to see if you could stay on for 5 more minutes or if you had to jump.
Yeah, I'm good till the bottom of the hour.
I unfortunately do have to jump,
Okay.
but thank you so much. And I'm
Thanks,
excited
Jill.
about all of you doing solar.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Cool.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
And I'm good to stay on as well.
Well, let's then try to keep it to maybe 5 minutes or less. If anyone has any additional questions, unmute yourself and ask away. If not, then we can just go to break. There was a question, I think, in the previous section that I was just looking at around production guarantees. So the question was, are production guarantees typically only required with I guess, are production guarantees required both in third-party owned systems and also city or county owned systems? Are production guarantees typically required with both?
I was just going to add, how do you do them? Single year, 3-year average, 5-year average, or whatever?
Mark, I don't know if you have any feedback on it.
Yeah,
I have my thoughts.
Yeah, we like to go for 2 years so that there's not a whole lot of complexity if you get a year that's strangely cloudy. So that just kind of averages out a bit longer. And usually around 85% there. It's not a huge concern, I think, for a PPA counterparty, which is most of our customers, in fact, all but one, because it's in everyone's interest to keep the system operating as well as it can. But you do want some protection in the case of maybe a very poor operation, because you're losing the opportunity to gain savings if you have someone that signed up a PPA and then just has a terrible system operating. So it's usually a relatively minor issue, but it is there. And again, for cash sale projects, which I'm much less familiar with, I would guess that you would want a relatively strong production guarantee of 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, and the experience we've had with production guarantees on EPC deals, so there's always like a commissioning test to show that it's, they basically have to make sure that it's within a certain percentage of what the helioscopes showed that it would produce at that point in time to make sure that the system's up and working. To get a production guarantee that's high, we found, and I think like 95% was the types of numbers. We found it was not worth the cost to be able to get that production guarantee. And as Mark mentioned, these systems work unless they're built really poorly. But if you're working with the right types of customers, these systems should be producing what they are. And then from the production guarantee standpoint, sometimes, they definitely will want to be the ones doing the O&M in order to be, saying that they'll be able to do those numbers so that they have that maintenance under their control.
Thanks. Well, I know we're just about at that 5 minutes, so I'll just include one last question, maybe like a yes or no, so a quick response. Bridget had a question on, is it typical to require a 20-year product warranty on panels, or would that keep you from responding?
Panels, that's not a problem. That's a pass-through warranty.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I don't want to keep you over time too much longer, Mark and Victoria. So thanks a lot for your time, both yesterday and today. I think it was very valuable for the cities and counties and also myself. So appreciated your time. So thanks a lot.
No problem. Good luck all.
Thank you.
Thank you.